Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the curtain on the medieval world, but not the storybook version, with polished knights, glowing castles, and chivalry. Forget all that. Tonight we're diving into the filth, the shame, and the strange habits that history books usually sweep under the rug. The kind of facts that make you wrinkle your nose or mutter under your breath. There's no way people actually lived like this. Spoiler, they did. And worse. Before we begin, do me a favour. If you're enjoying these late night journeys into history's dirtiest corners, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always surreal to me that some of you are brushing your teeth in Sydney while others are half asleep in Chicago, nodding off to the sound of chamber pots being emptied into a muddy street. So, get comfortable, pull that blanket tighter, dim the lights, because you're about to step into a world where the smell of rotting meat mixed with human waste clung to every street corner, where villagers dumped slop from windows without looking, and where people thought rubbing dog dung on their scalp could cure baldness. This is a world where animals weren't just food, they were defendants in court. Imagine a pig squealing as it's dragged before a judge, sentenced to death for murder, where monks measured time not by clocks but by how long it took to boil an egg. And if the egg cracked, well, you were late to prayer, and where wearing a dead man's tooth strung on a cord was a legitimate cure for your toothache. But that's just scratching the surface. Because in this world, the bizarre wasn't bizarre. It was normal. No one flinched at neighbours bathing once a year. No one laughed when someone swore their stomach pain came from demons hiding in their intestines. And no one questioned the stench of a church pew where incense mixed with sweat, mildew, and the sour tang of unwashed pilgrims. So, congratulations. You've just woken up in medieval Europe. A place where superstition and filth went hand in hand, where shameful habits were shrugged off as daily life, and where the strangest facts aren't just true, they're a reminder of just how far we've come. Welcome to the strangest, dirtiest medieval facts you've never heard of. If you got sick in the Middle Ages, your biggest problem wasn't the illness, it was the cure. Medieval medicine was a cocktail of superstition, desperation, and the kind of filth you wouldn't touch with gloves on today. Doctors believed the body was ruled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were coughing blood, they didn't ask why. They just said you had too much blood and needed to balance it out. How? With leeches sucking your skin raw, or with a knife slicing open your veins to drain a few pints onto the dirt floor. You'd be pale, dizzy, and probably closer to death than you started. But hey, at least your humours were balanced. But that was the respectable stuff. The nastiest cures came from ordinary people who didn't have access to doctors or apothecaries. Got a skin infection? Rub dog dung on it. Toothache? Tie a dead man's tooth around your neck. Suffering from gout? Drink a broth made from boiled owl. Women were told that rubbing menstrual blood on their faces could cure acne. And if you had epilepsy, some healers suggested you drink the warm blood of a freshly killed gladiator. Yes, that happened, and it gets worse. Many cures revolved around urine. Physicians tasted it to diagnose illness, and people washed wounds in it because it was thought to be cleansing. Some even rinsed their teeth with it. Imagine leaning close to someone's breath after that. No wonder medieval towns smelled like open sewers. They were open sewers and people were willingly splashing in the contents. Superstition ran just as deep. If a woman struggled to conceive, midwives might recommend tying a rooster's testicles around her waist. For stomach pain, you could swallow a live frog. To cure jaundice, people were told to eat raw mice. And if you were wealthy, you could pay for the most fashionable cure of all, powdered mummy. Yes, actual ground-up corpses imported from Egypt, sold as medicine in Europe for centuries. People mixed it into drinks, rubbed it into wounds, and thought they were absorbing the strength of the dead. In reality, they were just ingesting rot. And the irony? Most of these cures made you worse. Open wounds smeared with filth, infections from reused bandages, parasites spreading from raw animal parts. But in a world where death was everywhere, in childbirth, in wars, in plagues, people would try anything. Shame, disgust, or logic didn't matter. Survival did. So the next time you complain about modern medicine tasting bad, remember, in the Middle Ages, the cure for your cough might have been a spoonful of warm sheep dung mixed with honey. And yes, people swallowed it. Forget the feasts you've seen in movies, roasted pigs with apples in their mouths, golden goblets overflowing with wine, knights tearing into platters of steaming meat. The truth? Most medieval food was rotten, infested, and downright disgusting. If you lived back then, your meals would have been a gamble between hunger and food poisoning. Start with bread, the medieval staple. For the poor, bread wasn't fluffy or white. It was dark, dense, and often stretched with filler. Ground up tree bark, pea flour, even powdered straw. Sometimes bakers mixed in chalk or clay to make it look more substantial. Worse still, the grinding stones that milled the flour shed bits of grit. Every bite of bread sanded down your teeth like sandpaper, leaving most people toothless by middle age. Meat, unless you were wealthy, you almost never saw fresh meat. Ordinary people relied on salted or smoked cuts, and salted usually meant the flesh was half rotting before it ever hit the brine. You'd chew through sinew, gristle, and fat while the rancid taste lingered on your tongue. Worms wriggling in sausages? Common. Insects in flour? Normal. And if you did somehow afford a fresh chicken, there was no refrigeration. It had been dead for days, covered in flies and stinking long before it made it to your table. And fish, oh, fish was worse. In coastal areas, sure, you might get something fresh, but inland, fish travelled for days in barrels of brine, sloshing in salt water until it tasted like mush and reeked of rot. Wealthy nobles masked the stench with spices, but peasants couldn't afford that luxury. They just swallowed and hoped milk was no better. Without pasteurization, it soured almost instantly. People turned it into butter or cheese, but even those spoiled quickly, crawling with maggots. Some folks ate them anyway. Protein was protein. There's even evidence that people didn't always scrape the worms out of cheese because they considered it part of the meal. And then there was water. Most towns had rivers running through them, but those rivers doubled as open sewers. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the streets, which flowed into the streams, which everyone then drank from. Unless you were lucky enough to have access to a clean well, your water was laced with human waste. No wonder beer and ale were the safe drinks of choice. They were low in alcohol, but the boiling killed off some of the filth. Of course, that didn't stop brewers from cutting corners. Sometimes they added soot, sawdust, or even poisonous herbs to stretch the batch. Nobles fared better, but not by much. Their feasts looked extravagant, but many of the dishes were bizarre attempts to cover rot. Cooks drowned meat in vinegar, or spices to disguise foul smells. They painted old birds with saffron to make them look fresh. They even sewed cooked animals back into their skins, so they looked whole when brought to the table. Imagine biting into a peacock whose feathers had been reattached with glue after roasting. That was considered impressive dining. And yet people still ate, because they had no choice. Hunger was constant. Famines swept through villages every few years. And when crops failed, people resorted to boiling weeds, eating grass, or gnawing on leather. Chronic malnutrition left most peasants stunted, thin, and vulnerable to disease. So if you're picturing yourself at a medieval banquet right now, don't imagine the silver platters or golden goblets. Imagine sour beer, mouldy bread, salted meat crawling with worms, and everyone pretending not to notice. That was dinner. When people imagine medieval Europe, they often picture peasants who never bathed, coated in layers of filth. The truth is a little messier. Yes, they did bathe, but the way they did it was its own disaster. And sometimes, not bathing at all was actually safer. Let's start with public bathhouses. In towns and cities they were common. Big wooden tubs or shallow pools where people gathered to wash. Sounds civilized, right? Except the water wasn't changed for every visitor. You'd step into a lukewarm soup, already clouded with sweat, dirt, grease, hair, and whatever ran off the last dozen bodies. If you were unlucky, there might even be lice floating on the surface. Some chroniclers described bathhouse water as grey broth, and that wasn't an exaggeration. And these weren't just places to wash. Bathhouses doubled as hangouts, social clubs, and brothels. It wasn't unusual to share a tub with strangers of the opposite sex, and more than one bathhouse got shut down for being too friendly. Authorities constantly complained that washing was just the cover story. Imagine you're trying to scrub off dirt while the couple in the next tub is, well, busy. For peasants in the countryside, things weren't any better. Most didn't have access to fancy bathhouses. They bathed in rivers or streams, the same rivers where people emptied chamber pots, slaughtered animals, and washed laundry. You'd get rid of the sweat, sure, but you'd pick up every disease floating downstream. Dysentery was practically a bathhouse souvenir. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want near your skin. Made from animal fat and lye, it was harsh, smelly, and sometimes caustic enough to burn. Many people skipped it entirely and just scraped their skin with knives or pumice stones. One slip, and you went from cleaning yourself to cutting yourself. A dangerous thing in a world where infections killed fast. And then there was the church. By the later Middle Ages, the church frowned on public baths. Too much nudity, too much temptation, too many sins of the flesh happening in hot water. As a result, many people stopped bathing altogether, believing dirt was safer than damnation. Some even bragged about how rarely they washed. One chronicler claimed Queen Isabella of Castile only bathed twice in her life. The irony? People believed disease spread through bad smells. Miasma. So instead of actually washing, they doused themselves in perfumes, incense, or scented cloths to mask the stink. Nobles wore pomanders, little balls filled with spices, to hang from their belts. All it did was make the odour more complex. Sweat plus lavender plus rotting meat. And hair, another nightmare. Lice were everywhere. People shaved their heads or wore tight linen caps to keep the vermin at bay, but infestations were constant. Some folks rubbed mercury or vinegar into their scalps as treatment. It didn't work, and mercury slowly poisoned them. So, were medieval people filthy? Yes, but not for lack of trying. They wanted to be clean, but their methods made things worse. Instead of washing away disease, they marinated in it. If you think public bathhouses were bad, wait until you hear about medieval toilets. Because the truth is, most people didn't have one. In castles, the nobles had what were called garderobes, little stone chambers jutting out over the walls with a hole in the floor. Waste dropped straight down into a pit, or worse, into the moat. That's right, the same moat that defenders might one day use as protection was basically a giant open sewer. Imagine standing guard while arrows are flying, and you're up to your knees in a stew of human waste. Some moats were so clogged with excrement that they stank year-round. and the garderobe wasn't exactly private. Drafts of cold air rushed up through the hole, sometimes carrying back the smell of everything below. People claimed demons could climb up those shafts at night, so some households kept iron bars across the opening to stop evil spirits and rats from coming up while you were, well, vulnerable. For peasants, things were far less elegant. Most just had a wooden bucket or a chamber pot. You did your business indoors, then dumped it out the window into the street below with a quick shout of "Gardyloo," a warning cry. If you didn't shout, someone got a nasty surprise. Streets ran with urine and feces, mixing with rainwater and animal waste, until they became thick, stinking sludge. In hot weather, it was unbearable. Chroniclers wrote about entire towns smelling like one endless latrine. Public latrines existed in some larger towns, long wooden benches with multiple holes, often perched above a running stream. In theory, that sounds smart. In practice, those streams were the same ones people drew drinking water from. One person's waste became another's dinner. And wiping? Let's just say there was no toilet paper. Wealthier households might use scraps of linen or wool rags, which were washed and reused. Poorer folk relied on moss, hay, grass, or whatever they had on hand. In some places, people even kept communal sponges on sticks, dipped in buckets of water or vinegar. Think about that, a sponge shared by dozens of strangers every day. It's no wonder intestinal diseases were rampant. Archaeologists have found cesspits filled with layers of waste beneath medieval homes, still packed with parasite eggs centuries later. Roundworm, whipworm, tapeworm, all thriving inside human guts because sanitation was a joke. Imagine coughing up worms in the morning and not even being surprised by it. That was normal. The stench of medieval towns wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Epidemics of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera ripped through communities, fueled by the filth beneath everyone's feet. People thought bad smells caused disease, so they burned herbs or carried flowers under their noses. They were half right. The stink did signal danger, but not in the way they thought. And yet somehow they got used to it. Visitors from cleaner parts of the world, like travellers from the Islamic Middle East, where water systems were far more advanced, often wrote in horror about European filth. To them, it was shocking. To the locals, just another day. So next time you're annoyed about waiting for a bathroom in public, remember, in medieval times, you were lucky if the street outside your home wasn't literally ankle deep in shit. Picture a long wooden table, candles flickering, trenchers of bread laid out as plates, and steaming pots of stew. From a distance, a medieval meal might look cosy, even hearty. But look closer, and the illusion crumbles fast. Because medieval eating wasn't just about food, it was about dirt, parasites, and the kind of contamination that would horrify anyone today. First off, utensils were rare. Most people ate with their hands. Nobles might use knives, but forks didn't really catch on in Europe until much later. Imagine dozens of hands plunging into the same communal dish, greasy fingers dipping, bread soaking up broth, and everyone licking and redipping. Germs weren't part of medieval vocabulary, but if they had been, dinner would have looked like a biological nightmare. The bread trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates, absorbed grease and meat juices. When diners finished, the bread was often thrown to the poor or the household dogs. Sounds charitable, right? Except those trenchers were basically soggy, bacteria-soaked sponges. The lucky beggar who ate them often got more than dinner, diarrhea, worms, or worse. And the food itself? Full of surprises. Meat wasn't fresh unless you lived right next to a farm. Preservation relied on heavy salting, smoking, or drying. Too much salt left meat almost inedible, so cooks drowned it in spices or sauces to mask the taste. Spoiled meat was often served anyway, its stench disguised with vinegar, honey, or a fistful of pepper. Chroniclers mention entire feasts where guests got sick from rancid dishes. Insects were everywhere. Grain stored for bread was often crawling with weevils or beetles, but people baked it anyway. You'd bite into a loaf and crunch down on a roasted bug without blinking. Worms wriggled out of cheese, and nobody thought twice. Fresh vegetables were rare for the poor, mostly cabbages, onions or peas, often eaten half rotten. And since kitchens weren't exactly sanitary, food was frequently spiced with a side of dirt, ash or hair. Drinking was no safer. Water sources were polluted by latrines and waste, so beer and ale became the go-to drinks, even for children. Weak ale was brewed daily in households, cloudy and warm, often with floating bits of yeast and sediment. The safer choice was still a gamble. Wine existed, but it was sour, gritty, and frequently watered down. Sweetened wines often got their flavour not from fruit, but from lead-based additives. Yes, people were slowly poisoning themselves. Parasites thrived. Archaeologists have found medieval latrine soil packed with tapeworm and roundworm eggs, proof that undercooked meat and dirty food passed infection from table to table. Imagine finishing your stew only to feel your stomach churn for weeks as a worm grew inside you, sometimes long enough to slither out of your body in grotesque ways. And let's not forget table manners. Spitting bones and gristle directly onto the floor was common. Dogs roamed underfoot, snapping up scraps. Men wiped greasy hands on their clothes, or on the same tablecloth everyone else used. Public feasts were a cacophony of burps, farts, and drunken shouting. Chroniclers complained that banquets often ended with vomiting, and sometimes not just in private. Guests would puke at the table, then keep eating. Food wasn't just about nourishment, it was a test of survival. You weren't eating clean protein and vitamins. You were eating decay, filth, and hidden killers disguised with spice. For the poor, a bowl of gruel might be dinner for days. For the rich, a banquet was a minefield of spoiled delicacies. Either way, your stomach was never truly safe. So congratulations, if you were a medieval diner, every bite was a gamble, one where flavour battled rot, and the odds were stacked in favour of disease. If you think medieval meals were disgusting, wait until you peek into their bedrooms. The romanticised image of knights and maidens whispering by candlelight leaves out one overwhelming truth. Everything smelled. And not just a little. Bodies, beds, even the air itself carried the funk of sweat, rot, and disease. Daily bathing? Forget it. Most peasants might bathe once or twice a year, if at all. Water was cold, soap was crude, and public bathhouses were often associated with sin, scandal, and sex. For many, simply washing their face and hands counted as clean. So when two people climbed into bed together, the scent wasn't roses. It was weeks of sweat, dirt, and the musk of labour. Clothes rarely came off. Undergarments, if you had them, were wool or linen, scratchy, often damp with sweat. Many couples didn't undress fully because bedrooms were drafty and blankets thin. Imagine fumbling for warmth under heavy wool, with lice crawling in the seams, fleas jumping from mattress to skin, and bedbugs biting through the night. And that mattress, a sack stuffed with straw that reeked of mould, rodents, and human fluids accumulated over years. For contraception, Forget modern methods. Women used desperate, sometimes dangerous tricks, inserting herbs like rue or pennyroyal, which could poison them, or tying amulets and charms to their thighs. Others relied on withdrawal or prayers, but pregnancies were constant, and miscarriages and infant deaths were heartbreakingly common. Diseases were rampant. The lack of hygiene meant infections spread easily, and sexually transmitted ones were no exception. Syphilis and gonorrhea circulated long before anyone understood what caused them. Remedies were bizarre: rubbing mercury on sores, drinking potions made from bizarre ingredients, or visiting quack doctors who promised cures that did more harm than good. Even within marriage, sex wasn't always about love. For peasants, it could be a brief, clumsy act squeezed between daily chores, children sleeping nearby, or livestock in the same room. For nobles, intimacy was often duty, producing heirs, not pleasure. And among the clergy, forbidden, yet frequently indulged. Priests, monks and nuns all left behind records of scandalous affairs, proving that celibacy was more theory than practice. And then there were the taboos. The church constantly tried to police when and how people had sex. Not on Sundays, not during Lent, not while a woman was menstruating, not during pregnancy, not right after childbirth. The list was so long that some joked there were only a few legal days left in the year. Of course, many ignored these rules, adding guilt and secrecy to something already tangled with dirt and danger. Imagine it. You roll over on a straw bed, trying to ignore the scratching of lice, the smell of your partner's unwashed body, and the freezing draught sneaking under the door. Passion burned fast, but the aftertaste was always sweat, shame, and the risk of sickness. So yes, medieval intimacy happened. But romance, that was the fantasy. The reality was messy, itchy, smelly, and often regretted by morning. If you thought intimacy in the Middle Ages was already a messy gamble, the so-called medical cures of the time make it even worse. Doctors, and by doctors, I mean a mix of barber surgeons, herbalists, and wandering quacks, prescribe treatments that sound more like curses than remedies. Take impotence, for example. Medieval texts suggest bizarre concoctions: ground up animal testicles mixed with wine, or rubbing goose fat on one's genitals to restore vigour. Some even recommended carrying a dried weasel's testicle in a pouch around the neck, as though virility could be summoned like a magic spell. For women, if desire seemed too weak, healers advised drinking potions made of mashed nettles, honey and goat's milk, guaranteed to taste worse than the problem: menstrual pain. Physicians told women to sit over steaming bowls of herbs, sometimes mixed with urine, while priests whispered blessings nearby. And if a woman was too lustful, she might be ordered to wear a chastity belt, not as a romantic legend, but as a real and humiliating device of iron that caused more infections than it prevented sins. Sexually transmitted diseases, though not understood, were everywhere. One cure for sores below the waist was to apply a paste of vinegar and ashes, a burning reminder of the disease. Another recommended bathing in hot wine, or even quicksilver, which we now know is mercury. The treatment often killed the patient before the disease did. Infertility, a constant fear, was blamed on women almost exclusively. Remedies included swallowing crushed animal bones, drinking the milk of a woman who had just given birth to a boy, or, disturbingly, smearing menstrual blood on the husband's body as a kind of fertility charm. And when nothing worked, couples turned to prayers, pilgrimages, or offerings at holy shrines, hoping divine intervention would succeed where goose fat had failed. Even stranger were the superstitions tied to nocturnal emissions, which the church treated as near sinful. Manuals warned men that these accidents were the devil's tricks, weakening their bodies and souls. Remedies: sleeping with holy relics under the bed, or reciting psalms until exhaustion prevented arousal. And behind all of this lurked shame. The body was treated as a battlefield between sin and salvation, pleasure and punishment. A cough or sore could brand someone as cursed. A barren woman could be whispered about as witch-touched. And anyone caught seeking the wrong cures risked both ridicule and damnation. So next time you imagine the flicker of candles in some medieval bedchamber, remember that just beyond the door might be a healer with a jar of goose fat, a priest with a warning, and an apothecary grinding dried animal parts into a powder no one wanted to drink. Pregnancy in medieval Europe was less a miracle and more a gauntlet of superstition, filth, and constant danger. The moment a woman showed signs of carrying a child, the community around her turned into a circus of old wives' tales and grotesque remedies. Forget prenatal vitamins or sterile hospitals. Here, pregnancy meant enduring bizarre rituals and medical advice that ranged from mildly absurd to utterly horrifying. Women were told to avoid looking at ugly animals during pregnancy, because people believed the unborn child could take on the features of whatever the mother stared at. A glance at a pig could mean a baby with a pig's snout, they feared. Others swore that if a pregnant woman craved too much salt, her baby would be cursed with dry, flaky skin. Imagine the constant stress of living in a world where every glance, every bite of food, every word spoken could supposedly deform the child you were carrying. And then there were the charms. One proven method to ensure a safe pregnancy was to wear the dried womb of a rabbit, strung around the neck like a pendant. Another suggested carrying a rooster's testicles sewn into a leather pouch. These were whispered secrets from midwives who swore by them, and desperate women followed along, because what else could they do? With no understanding of biology, superstition filled the void, and amulets made from bones, hair, and animal organs dangled against sweating skin under heavy wool dresses. But it got worse when labour began. The filth of the medieval world came crashing down. There was no clean birthing bed. Women gave birth on straw mats or wooden planks smeared with old stains of blood and fluids from countless births before theirs. Midwives dipped their hands in oil, wine, or sometimes even spit, believing it made them slicker for pulling a baby free. Forget gloves. Their hands were bare, often unwashed, carrying every disease they had picked up in the village that week. The air was thick with heat, sweat, and incense burned in the corner to drive away evil spirits. Neighbours might crowd the room, muttering prayers, crossing themselves, or whispering gossip while the woman screamed through contractions. Some households believed that tying the knots of a rope or cloth near the birthing bed could lock the baby inside, so every knot in the house had to be untied before labour began. Imagine servants rushing through a house, untying shoelaces, unlatching doors, even loosening hair braids, as if that could magically open the birth canal. And when things went wrong, which they often did, the horror only deepened. With no surgery, no antiseptic, no understanding of infection, many women and babies died in agony. Midwives sometimes resorted to inserting sharp instruments to pull the baby out, leaving mothers mutilated or bleeding to death. Surviving such a process was a gamble, and women knew it. Every pregnancy was a brush with death, a whispered prayer that they might not leave their children motherless. Then came the aftermath. Birth fluids seeped into straw bedding, attracting flies within hours. The smell of iron-rich blood mingled with sweat and smoke. Some families believed burning herbs or sprinkling holy water over the mess would keep away demons, but what it really kept away was nothing. The stench lingered, clinging to the walls, the sheets, the skin of the exhausted mother. And here's the unspoken truth. Women were expected to return to their duties almost immediately. Rest, that was a luxury for noble women. Peasant women might be back in the fields within days, carrying infants wrapped in rags still damp from hurried washing. For them, childbirth wasn't just filthy and dangerous. It was just another job in a life already filled with endless toil. So while we imagine medieval families rejoicing at the birth of a child, the reality was darker. Women carried charms of animal organs, endured bloody straw mats, and prayed to saints who never answered. Survival was rare enough to be considered a blessing. And the stains left behind, they weren't just physical. They were memories etched into every mother who lived through the filth and fear of medieval childbirth. If childbirth was a gamble with death, avoiding pregnancy in the first place became an obsession. And what medieval women resorted to was as bizarre as it was revolting. Forget pills, latex, or any real science. Birth control in the Middle Ages was a cocktail of superstition, filth, and sheer desperation. And the lengths women went to are shocking. One of the most common solutions was the charm or amulet. Women tied dried animal parts, like the foot of a weasel or the genitals of a hare, to their thighs, believing it would somehow block conception. Some wore pouches filled with pulverized toad bones, others tucked dried herbs into their belts. It sounds laughable now, but to them, these talismans carried life or death weight. Imagine carrying a smelly lump of rotting rabbit flesh in your skirts just to avoid another dangerous pregnancy. Then there were the potions. Medieval recipes for contraception read like a witch's brew. One cure called for grinding willow bark, dog's urine, and mule hooves together into a thick paste that a woman would drink daily. Another suggested mixing pigeon droppings with honey and swallowing it at the new moon. Some even swallowed powdered lead or mercury, convinced it would cool the womb. It didn't cool anything. It poisoned them slowly, ruining teeth, hair and organs. The tragic irony, women often killed themselves trying to keep from conceiving. But the most revolting method, vaginal pessaries made from things you'd never want near your body. Women inserted mixtures of wool soaked in vinegar, mashed garlic, or even dung into themselves, hoping the acidity or stench would repel sperm. Some records even describe women using live insects, beetles or worms, sealed inside small cloth packets, stuffed into the vagina to act as living barriers. The idea was that the creature's movements kept men from depositing seed effectively. The thought alone is nauseating, but desperate times drove desperate measures. And then there were the rituals. Priests warned against sex on certain days, claiming it would guarantee conception. So women who wanted to avoid pregnancy flipped the advice upside down. They deliberately sought sex on days said to be cursed, like feast days of saints or during the menstrual cycle, believing the union wouldn't stick. In other words, women risked damnation and scandal just to survive without bearing another child. Of course, contraception wasn't just about herbs and charms. Some women tried sheer brutality. There are accounts of women beating their own stomachs, plunging into icy rivers after sex, or squatting over steaming pots of herbs in an early form of fumigation. The idea was that the hot smoke or violent shocks would flush out or kill the seed. More often, it left burns, infections, or miscarriages that endangered the woman's life. And here's the darker layer. Husbands often hated the idea of their wives controlling reproduction. Church leaders condemned contraception as sinful, accusing women of witchcraft if they were caught using herbs or charms. Some women were beaten, imprisoned, or even executed simply for trying to protect themselves from endless pregnancies. Controlling their own fertility was not only filthy, humiliating, and dangerous, it was illegal. The result? A culture where women's bodies were battlegrounds, their desperation hidden behind locked doors. They stitched strange packets of herbs into their skirts, whispered forbidden recipes to daughters, and risked death to avoid death. The irony of it all is haunting. The very act of trying to live free from pregnancy could kill you faster than childbirth itself. And yet, they kept doing it. Because in the medieval world, pregnancy wasn't just life-giving, it was life-threatening. And if rabbit genitals, worm-filled pouches, or drinking mule hoof potions gave them even a sliver of hope, women were willing to endure it. If you think periods are still treated with awkward silence today, medieval Europe would make your jaw drop. Menstruation wasn't just taboo, it was treated as something monstrous, dirty, even dangerous. And the ways women were forced to handle it? Absolutely horrifying. Let's start with the beliefs. Medieval men, doctors, priests, husbands, often described menstrual blood as poisonous. Texts from the time warned that a woman on her period could sour wine just by looking at it, kill crops by walking through fields, and even cause dogs to go rabid with a single glance. One physician wrote that menstrual blood was the vilest corruption of the body. Another claimed it was literally toxic and could rot metal. Imagine being a peasant woman, just trying to live your life, while your neighbours whispered that your monthly cycle could kill them. And hygiene? Forget modern pads or tampons. Women used whatever was available, old rags, tufts of wool, moss, hay, or nothing at all. Some tucked bundles of grass into their underclothes. Others simply let it flow, staining their skirts, their sheets, the church pews they knelt on. If you were poor, you didn't have the luxury of changing cloths often. Some reused the same rag month after month until it stank and rotted. Infection wasn't a risk, it was inevitable. Vaginal sores, urinary infections, and even death followed women who had no choice but to shove filth into their bodies. The shame ran deep. Women on their period were often barred from touching holy objects. In some regions, they weren't even allowed into churches. Husbands avoided them, calling them unclean. Priests thundered from pulpits about menstrual blood as proof of Eve's sin, a visible mark of women's inferiority. And when men avoided their wives for a week, they often turned to brothels instead. A cruel irony that meant menstrual women were punished with both disgust and betrayal. But the horror goes further. Some medical experts in the Middle Ages recommended that menstrual blood be used as medicine. Yes, collected and drunk. Recipes for love potions, fertility cures, even plague protection included drops of menstrual blood mixed into wine. This wasn't whispered folklore. Scholars wrote it down with authority. So while women were shamed for bleeding, men simultaneously fetishized and exploited it. The practical side was just as degrading. Women with heavy bleeding sometimes tied small leather pouches under their skirts to catch the flow. They weren't changed often. They stank. Imagine a marketplace filled with the smell of sweat, dung, and menstrual rags drying in the sun. That was everyday life. Husbands complained about it in letters. Neighbours mocked women for it. But no one offered real solutions. Instead, shame kept them silent. And then there was sex. Officially, the The church banned intercourse during menstruation. Priests claimed it produced sickly children, or even monsters, but men didn't always care. Some sought it out in secret, whispering that sleeping with a menstruating woman brought good luck or heightened passion. Others forced themselves on their wives regardless, leaving women powerless to refuse. The result? Women carried both the stigma of being untouchable and the trauma of being used when they were most vulnerable. The cruelty was constant. A woman bleeding was considered dangerous, unclean, and shameful. Yet at the same time, her blood was stolen for charms, her body was taken against her will, and her pain was ignored. That double standard haunted every medieval woman, from queens to peasants. The monthly reality that all women shared became one of their greatest sources of humiliation. So imagine this. You're standing in a small stone hut, clutching a piece of rough wool between your legs while your neighbours whisper that you could spoil their butter just by standing too close. That wasn't a nightmare. That was medieval life, and it was as filthy, shameful, and absurd as history ever got. If menstruation was wrapped in shame and silence, pregnancy and childbirth were wrapped in terror. For medieval women, bringing new life into the world was often just a slow dance with death. No anaesthesia, no antiseptic, no professional doctors willing to touch a woman's body, just pain, dirt and prayer. From the moment a woman started showing, her life changed. Neighbours whispered superstitions about what she ate, what she looked at, and how she slept. If she stared too long at a crooked person, it was said her baby would be born deformed. If she looked at animals during sex, her child might take on their features. And if she craved strawberries but couldn't get them, the child was believed to be born with red blotches on its skin. Everything a pregnant woman did was blamed for the outcome. And if the baby died, so did her reputation. There were no prenatal checkups. Care often meant being told not to ride a horse, not to lift heavy things, and not to get too emotional, because strong feelings were thought to shake the womb. Herbal remedies filled the gaps. Women drank teas of fennel, pennyroyal, or mugwort to ease swelling or calm nausea, but these herbs were also dangerous abortifacients. A little too much, and you weren't eating morning sickness. You were killing yourself and the child, but nothing compared to childbirth itself. Forget sterile rooms or clean hands. Most births took place on dirt floors, in smoky huts, or in cramped townhouses, with no light and no warmth. A midwife, usually an older woman, sometimes a healer with questionable knowledge, presided over the process. She had no surgical tools, no medical training, just experience and faith. Her hands weren't washed. She reused cloths soaked in blood. If she cut the umbilical cord with a knife, that knife might also be used to butcher chickens or scrape hides. Infection wasn't just common, it was expected. And the pain, medieval women were told it was a divine punishment, a curse left behind from Eve's sin. In pain you shall bring forth children, priests reminded them. So there was no relief, no compassion. Screams echoed through villages, but people shrugged. It was the natural order of things. Women stuffed rags between their teeth to keep from biting through their tongues. Some prayed until they fainted. Some simply bled out, dying nameless deaths on straw mats. Superstitions guided every step. If labour dragged on, neighbours tied charms around the woman's thighs, keys, relics, or even dead men's bones to open the passage. If the baby was breech, women were sometimes held upside down and shaken. Midwives muttered prayers, burned incense, or even pressed holy books to the mother's belly. And if the child was stillborn, blame fell on the mother. Clearly, she'd sinned. Clearly, She hadn't obeyed the rules. Clearly, God was punishing her. The filth was unrelenting. Rags soaked with blood were washed and reused. Afterbirth was thrown outside for animals to scavenge. Flies buzzed, dogs sniffed at the door, and the smell lingered for days. If the woman survived, she was often left torn, feverish, and too weak to walk. Postpartum infection, what we'd now call sepsis, killed countless mothers within a week of giving birth. And nobody understood why. They simply said, God took her. The baby wasn't safe either. Infant mortality was astronomical. Half of all children died before the age of 5. Newborns were weak, born into filth, and fed with dirty spoons or shared milk. Baptism was rushed within hours, not just for salvation, but because everyone knew the child might not live through the night. Mothers clutched babies they knew they'd bury before spring. But perhaps the cruelest part? There was no privacy, no dignity. Birth was public, communal. Women gave birth surrounded by neighbours, relatives, and sometimes curious onlookers. Their bodies weren't sacred. They were just another battlefield where life and death clashed again and again. And while men celebrated new heirs in taverns, women were left alone in blood-soaked rooms, praying not to die before dawn. So imagine this. You're on your knees on a cold stone floor, sweat pouring, blood pooling, while your neighbours argue over whether to tie a key to your thigh or fetch the priest. That was childbirth in the Middle Ages, a miracle wrapped in misery, and a death sentence disguised as duty. If there was one thing medieval Europe obsessed over, almost as much as death, it was sex, and not in the way you might imagine. For women, the church transformed intimacy into a battlefield of guilt, regulation, and bizarre prohibitions. The female body wasn't just flesh, it was painted as a dangerous, sinful machine that needed constant supervision. Priests preached that women were naturally lustful, descended from Eve, and forever dragging men into sin. That meant every act of sex, even within marriage, was treated with suspicion. Manuals for confessors circulated across Europe, and inside them, pages upon pages of forbidden acts that priests demanded to hear about in graphic detail. Whether you kissed too long, touched in the wrong way, or dared to enjoy yourself, there was a penance waiting. Imagine stepping into a confessional and being interrogated about how many times you had sex last week, and in what positions. Priests weren't just spiritual guides, they became medieval sex police. But the rules themselves, they bordered on absurd. Sex on Sundays, a sin. Sex during Lent, a sin. Sex during Advent or Easter week, or on any of the 100+ holy days dotting the calendar, all forbidden. By some counts, nearly half the year was off limits. If you slipped up, your soul was in danger, and your neighbours might find out. Because confessions weren't always private. Sometimes priests used them to publicly humiliate women, turning personal life into a stage for shame. And then there were the rules about positions. Missionary was acceptable, barely. Anything else was branded unnatural, punishable with long fasts, pilgrimages, or worse. If a woman dared to climb on top, confessors warned, she risked giving birth to deformed children. If she enjoyed herself too much, she was called a temptress, her body likened to the devil's bait. Desire was never hers to own. It belonged to her husband, or to God, but never to her. Outside the church walls, society piled on more restrictions. Women were told to cover their hair, because loose hair was a sign of loose morals. Widows who remarried too quickly were accused of lust. Young brides were often lectured by priests right before their wedding night, told that their duty was to submit silently. without pleasure, without protest. The body wasn't for joy, it was for procreation, and procreation only. Yet behind all this shame, the reality was far messier. Archaeologists have found crude fertility charms hidden under floorboards. In secret, women sought out herbal tonics to spark desire or prevent pregnancy. Some slipped wild carrot seeds or pennyroyal into their drinks. Others whispered to cunning women in the village, asking for love potions, aphrodisiacs, or powders that promised to make a husband rise to the occasion. These practices were whispered about, feared and condemned, but they flourished anyway. Because desire doesn't vanish just because a priest writes a rule against it. And then there's the darker side. When women broke the rules, when gossip spread that a wife was too forward or too free, punishment could be cruel. Public humiliation was common. A woman accused of adultery might be paraded through the streets, with her hair cut short, her face smeared with tar or a noose around her neck. Some were forced to wear symbolic clothing, like donkey ears or wooden signs announcing their sin. It was entertainment as much as punishment, neighbours laughing while a woman's dignity was stripped bare. Even within marriage, the imbalance was brutal. A man could accuse his wife of infidelity with little proof, and she might face ruin. Meanwhile, his affairs with servants, prostitutes, or even other men were often brushed aside. The double standard was stark. Women's sexuality was dangerous, men's was natural, and the church did little to correct it. If anything, it reinforced it. So imagine this, it's late at night, your husband wants intimacy, but it's Lent, and you know the priest will ask about it in confession. You're caught between sinning against God or sinning against your spouse. Either way, someone claims ownership over your body. And it isn't you. That was the reality of sex and sin for medieval women, trapped under the watchful eyes of priests, husbands, and neighbours. What history books gloss over is that shame wasn't just an occasional burden, it was woven into every part of life. Women were told their bodies were unclean during menstruation, sinful during pleasure, and cursed in childbirth. They couldn't escape the judgment because it followed them everywhere, from the altar to the bedroom. If the church controlled women's bedrooms, the courts controlled their reputations. And medieval Europe had no shortage of bizarre and humiliating punishments for women accused of sexual sins. Forget Hollywood trials with solemn judges and powdered wigs. These were often chaotic spectacles, full of gossip, theatrics, and cruel justice. Take adultery. If a woman was caught, the shame wasn't handled quietly behind closed doors. In many towns, she could be paraded through the marketplace with her clothes torn or stripped down to her shift, forced to walk barefoot while neighbours jeered. Sometimes a rope was tied around her neck. Sometimes her hair was hacked off in front of everyone, a brutal symbol of dishonour. In Paris, some women were locked in an iron collar attached to a post and left to endure public ridicule. The humiliation was meant to hurt more than any physical punishment. The laughter, the pointing, the whispers that never went away. But things got darker. In England and parts of Germany, women accused of being scolds, nagging or gossiping wives were punished with the infamous scold's bridle, a metal cage that locked around the head with a plate pressing down on the tongue. Imagine being shoved into this device, your saliva dripping out as people laughed at you, all because someone thought you talked too much. For prostitutes or women suspected of promiscuity, similar devices could be used under the guise of moral correction. Public shame became a form of entertainment, and then there were the so-called cucking stools or ducking stools. A woman accused of sexual misconduct, or even just being quarrelsome, might be strapped into a chair and dunked into a filthy river over and over again. Crowds gathered to watch as she sputtered, gasped, and choked, the water searing her nose and lungs. Sometimes the river was little more than an open sewer, full of human waste, dead animals, and garbage. The punishment wasn't just humiliating, it was a deliberate infection risk. Many women left these sessions sick, weakened, or permanently scarred. Adultery wasn't the only crime dragged into public view. In Italy, church courts heard cases of unnatural lust, and the testimony is shockingly explicit. Women had to sit while priests asked invasive questions about what positions they used, how often they had sex, and whether they dared to enjoy it. Sometimes neighbours were called as witnesses, spinning gossip into legal testimony. Imagine your private life turned into a trial where half the town weighs in on what they think happens in your bedroom. And when it came to prostitutes, the hypocrisy was staggering. On one hand, brothels were licensed, taxed, and quietly tolerated. On the other, women who worked in them were fair game for public mockery. In Nuremberg, prostitutes had to wear striped clothing like prisoners, instantly marking them as outcasts. In some towns, they were banned from wearing shoes, forced to walk barefoot as a constant reminder of their fallen status. The men who visited them faced no punishment, of course. The shame fell entirely on the women. One of the most grotesque examples comes from France, where a woman accused of adultery might be sentenced to ride backwards on a donkey through the streets, holding its tail as reins. Children pelted her with mud and rotten vegetables while men jeered. The symbolism was clear. She was being reduced to an animal, her dignity stripped away, her shame made public. But here's the strangest part. These punishments didn't always come from male authorities. Sometimes other women joined in. Neighbours gossiped, rival wives accused each other. Whole groups of women mocked prostitutes to distance themselves from suspicion. In a world where a single rumour could ruin you, survival often meant joining the mob rather than standing against it. So picture this. You've been accused of adultery, maybe just because someone saw you talking too closely with a man in the market. The church summons you, the town gathers, and suddenly your body, your hair, your dignity are no longer yours. You're strapped to a stool, plunged into the river while the crowd cheers. The shame clings to you long after the water has dried. And there's no escape, because in medieval society, reputation was everything. And once it was gone for good. The Middle Ages loved to blur the line between punishment and medicine, and nowhere was this clearer than in how women's sexuality was treated. If you sinned, or even if you were merely suspected of being too lustful, there was a whole arsenal of remedies, cures that were often more disgusting, more humiliating, and more dangerous than the supposed problem. These weren't whispered home remedies. Many came straight from monks, physicians, and churchmen who truly believed they were healing women by subjecting them to misery. Start with bloodletting. Doctors in the medieval period thought that women's lust came from overheating of the womb. Their solution? Stick a knife into a vein and let the blood flow. Sometimes this meant the arm, but sometimes the veins in the ankle or foot were targeted, and in some extreme cases midwives or surgeons even made incisions closer to the genitals, claiming it cooled the fire of desire. Imagine lying on a rough table in a smoky room, weak and dizzy, while a so-called healer lets you bleed, just because someone accused you of being too interested in sex. Then came purgatives. If a woman was accused of promiscuity or simply suspected of unclean thoughts, she might be forced to swallow vile concoctions designed to purge the body. Recipes included crushed worms, bitter herbs, and even animal dung mixed into wine or vinegar. The logic? If lust was a poison, vomiting and diarrhea would drive it out. The reality? Women doubled over in pain, dehydrated and humiliated, all in the name of healing. Cleansing by water was another favourite. We already talked about ducking stools as punishment, but physicians also prescribed cold baths as treatment for lust. Women were dunked repeatedly in freezing rivers or immersed in tubs of icy water until their bodies went numb. It was supposed to cool the womb and reduce sinful desire. In truth, it risked shock, hypothermia, and pneumonia. But if a woman protested, that was seen as proof she needed it even more. And then there were the fumigations. Monks and physicians believed smoke could heal the womb. They'd place a woman over a pot of burning herbs, sometimes mint, sometimes sulphur, sometimes something far fouler, like animal hair or dung. She was forced to squat while the smoke rose into her body. Picture the smell, the sting in the eyes, the choking fumes filling your lungs. This wasn't healing, it was torment disguised as medicine. But perhaps the most grotesque were the so-called uterine cures. Some manuals suggested inserting strange substances directly into the vagina, honey mixed with ashes, ground up toads, or even powdered metals. These treatments were supposed to dry out or calm down the womb. Many of them caused burning, infections, or worse, yet desperate women, accused of being sinful or simply trying to stop pain, submitted to these humiliating rituals. And here's the cruel twist: none of this had anything to do with genuine medicine. Much of it was about control. By framing lust as a disease, male authorities could justify endless invasive practices. A woman who was seen as too sexual, too independent, or even just too outspoken could be treated until she was weak, ashamed, and submissive again. The cure was punishment, and the punishment was dressed up as cure. Sometimes it wasn't even priests or physicians, it was husbands. Manuals encouraged men to cool their wives' tempers with cold baths, restrictive diets, or even enforced bleeding. Imagine living with someone who could summon the authority of both medicine and religion to torture you under the guise of love. So let's put you there. You've been accused. Maybe a neighbour heard a laugh that sounded too flirtatious. Maybe your husband is jealous. Maybe a priest decided you were unclean. You're dragged into a chamber, forced to drink a concoction that burns your throat, then dunked into icy water while your teeth chatter uncontrollably. And when you finally collapse in exhaustion, the healer nods and says you're cured. Not because you are, but because you've been broken. The medieval world didn't just punish women for their bodies, it medicalized their pain, institutionalized their humiliation, and called it care. When most people imagine a medieval nunnery, they picture a serene cloister, chanting voices, quiet prayer, the smell of incense, and women dedicating themselves to God. But dig just a little deeper, and you find stories that are anything but holy. Behind those stone walls, women weren't just living in prayer. They were often subjected to humiliating and downright disturbing medical rituals. And these practices were almost always justified as saving their souls or healing their sins. One of the most shocking realities is how nuns were treated when they were accused of lustful thoughts or temptations of the flesh. Priests and confessors believed that women's bodies were ticking time bombs of sin, constantly threatening to drag them away from holiness. And so nuns were subjected to bizarre purifications. One chronicler from the 14th century describes a convent where women were made to sit naked in cold water baths, while psalms were sung over them, supposedly washing away their sinful urges. Picture a line of shivering women, teeth clattering, lips blue, while monks look on and chant about purity. Healing? Hardly. It was a spectacle of control. Another disturbing practice was fumigation. Much like the medical smoke cures inflicted on laywomen, convents sometimes used smoke as a purifying ritual. A nun accused of being too lustful or of breaking her vows might be made to squat over pots of burning herbs, with the smoke rising into her body. Officially, it was to cleanse her womb. Unofficially, it was an ordeal meant to break her spirit. Imagine the choking haze of burnt sage, rosemary, and sulphur, mixing with the stench of sweat and fear in a cold stone chamber. And then there were the confessions. Priests tasked with curing sinful thoughts often demanded excruciatingly detailed confessions of a nun's temptations. Some reports suggest that women were pushed to describe their dreams or intrusive thoughts in lurid detail, and those words, once spoken, were written down, preserved, and sometimes even circulated among churchmen as moral case studies. What should have been private shame was transformed into a public record of humiliation. You can imagine how degrading that must have felt, pouring out your most vulnerable thoughts, only for them to be dissected and judged by men who had all the power. Convents also enforced strict dietary punishments in the name of healing. Nuns suspected of sinful desires were put on bread and water diets for weeks, sometimes months. Starving women were easier to control, and hunger was seen as a way to cool the passions. Yet prolonged fasting caused weakness, fainting, and long-term damage. In some cases, nuns became so malnourished they could no longer perform their daily prayers. But rather than being treated with compassion, this collapse was seen as proof of spiritual purging. The irony? These women often entered convents not out of holy calling, but because their families forced them there. Some were second daughters with no inheritance, others were widows sent away so their property could be seized by relatives. Once inside, their bodies no longer belonged to them. Every thought, every action, every sin was subject to inspection. And if they resisted, they faced public shame within the convent walls, being paraded in front of their sisters, forced to wear humiliating garments, or even locked in small punishment cells called penitential closets, sometimes for days on end. One of the dirtiest secrets of convent life was that these rituals often blurred into obsession. Some confessors became fixated on the very sins they were supposed to root out, turning confession into an endless cycle of voyeurism and control. Women who dreamed of escape had nowhere to go. For many, the convent became a lifelong prison disguised as a holy sanctuary. So, put yourself there. You've been accused of having unclean thoughts. You're stripped of food, made to shiver in icy water baths, while voices echo off the stone walls. Then you're dragged into a smoky chamber, forced to squat over burning herbs, coughing as smoke burns your eyes and nose. Finally, you confess every dark corner of your imagination to a priest who listens too closely, writes it all down, and declares you healed. But inside, you're broken. Medieval nunneries weren't just houses of God. For countless women, they were places where shame was weaponized, where bodies were punished, and where healing was just another word for control. If you think convent life was all silence, prayer, and detachment from the flesh, brace yourself, because some of the most scandalous stories in medieval Europe came straight out of nunneries. When women were locked away together for life, denied the possibility of marriage, denied male companionship, denied even the freedom to walk the streets unsupervised, Where do you think they turned for comfort? The answer, whispered through centuries of church records and scandalous chronicles, is each other. There's a reason bishops and priests were so obsessed with monitoring nuns' behaviour. Repeatedly, inquisitors wrote about inappropriate bonds forming between sisters of the cloth. Some of these stories read like fevered fantasies of repressed churchmen, but others have that sting of truth. Women caught sneaking into each other's cells, after lights out, accused of holding each other too closely, or simply found guilty of affections unbecoming of their vows. In other words, love, tenderness, and intimacy that the cloister forbade. One of the most notorious cases comes from the 14th century France, where an abbess was accused of allowing sinful practices among her nuns. Witnesses claimed the sisters would embrace during long nights, consoling each other with whispers and touches forbidden by the rule of St. Benedict. Church authorities were outraged, but their very outrage reveals how common the practice must have been. After all, why make laws against something unless it's already happening? In some convents, these bonds weren't just private rebellions, they became open secrets. Historians have uncovered records of nuns forming tight-knit pairs, almost like secret marriages, with one woman often taking on a protective, almost masculine role, while the other played a more passive part. Such partnerships could last for years, hidden in plain sight behind the guise of sisterly friendship. To outsiders, it might look like innocent closeness. To those inside, it was survival, a way to find affection in a life otherwise stripped of warmth. But of course, the church didn't see it that way. When these bonds came to light, punishments were brutal. Nuns accused of female sodomy, yes, that was the actual term used in some records, could face public flogging, expulsion from the convent, or lifelong penance in solitary cells. In one German convent, 2 sisters caught together were forced to walk barefoot around the cloister, while the rest of the nuns chanted penitential psalms. Their heads were shaved, their clothes torn, their shame paraded for all to see. The irony? The same churchmen who punished them often recorded their confessions in scandalous detail, lingering over every sin with an almost voyeuristic fascination. It wasn't just about sex, though. These forbidden bonds were acts of rebellion. In a world where women were denied choice, stripped of agency, and forced into holy vows they might not have wanted, loving another nun was a way of seizing a fragment of control. It was an intimacy the outside world denied them, and that made it dangerous. And so convent records are full of warnings, accusations, and punishments. But beneath them all, you can still glimpse something else: tenderness, longing, the desperate human need for connection. Imagine it. You're trapped in a convent, cut off from the outside world, starved of affection, watched constantly. Then one night, a hand reaches for yours under the heavy wool blankets. A whisper breaks the silence of the dormitory. Suddenly the stone walls feel less like a prison. For a moment, you're not a prisoner of God's house. You're just a human being, alive, reaching out for warmth. And that's the dirty, dangerous truth the medieval church wanted to bury. That even in the most holy of places, love and desire refused to die. If nuns turning to each other was scandal enough, what happened when priests, the very men sent to guard their virtue, got involved? The answer is one of the dirtiest, most hypocritical secrets buried in church history. Behind closed doors, the confessional wasn't always a place of repentance. Sometimes it was a stage for manipulation, exploitation, and forbidden intimacy that no amount of incense could ever disguise. In theory, every nun was supposed to confess regularly to her spiritual father. She would kneel, head bowed, and whisper her sins while the priest, a man who held immense power over her life, sat in judgment. But what happens when the man on the other side of the grill isn't just listening? Repeatedly, medieval records reveal complaints of priests who took advantage of confession, coaxing, suggesting, even demanding physical penance that went far beyond a few Hail Marys. One infamous case comes from 15th century Spain, where a visiting friar was accused of seducing half the convent during his confessional rounds. His methods? He told nuns that their bodies were vessels of temptation, and that only by letting him test their chastity could they prove their devotion to God. Some of the women, terrified of disobedience, complied. Others reported him, but by the time an investigation began, the friar had disappeared, likely hidden by church officials eager to avoid scandal. This wasn't an isolated story. In Florence, city records mention a Dominican confessor who convinced young nuns that physical contact was spiritual purification. When one nun resisted, he threatened her with damnation. Another priest in Cologne was caught after multiple nuns admitted during confession that they had been pressured into comforting him when he was troubled in spirit. The irony? These confessions were then written down and circulated as evidence against the women themselves. The priests, more often than not, walked away free. And here's the dirtiest truth. Convents were tempting playgrounds for predatory priests. Dozens of young women, locked away, forbidden any contact with men, and bound by obedience to their confessors. It was the perfect imbalance of power. When church councils occasionally discussed these scandals, they never asked how to protect the women. Instead, they debated how to keep the shame from leaking into public knowledge. Protecting the institution mattered more than protecting the women inside it. But the women weren't always passive victims. In some records, you catch glimpses of rebellion. A group of nuns in 14th century France conspired to expose their confessor by deliberately giving him the same tempting story during confession. When he repeated the same manipulation to all of them, they went as a group to the bishop. The bishop, furious at the breach of secrecy, punished the nuns. Their heads were shaved, and they were locked in cells. The priest was quietly transferred to another parish. Imagine the tension of those secret conversations. A young nun, trembling as she kneels in the confessional, whispering sins she barely understands. A priest leaning closer, lowering his voice, twisting scripture to suit his desire. And afterward, she leaves with the weight of guilt, not knowing whether she's been absolved or abused. That was the impossible bind, where obedience to God's representative could mean surrendering her own dignity. It's a bitter irony. The convent was supposed to be a fortress of chastity, yet the very men tasked with guarding that chastity often became the greatest threat to it. And for every scandal that surfaced, how many more were swallowed in silence, sealed behind walls of shame and secrecy? Because the truth is this: medieval nunneries weren't untouched sanctuaries of purity. They were microcosms of power, desire, hypocrisy, and exploitation. And the confessional, that supposed holy channel between sinner and God, could just as easily become a trap. If there's one subject that truly embarrassed the medieval church, it was this: pregnant nuns. Because for all the vows of chastity, for all the sermons about purity, the reality was far messier and impossible to hide when a nun's belly began to swell beneath her habit. Records from across Europe tell us these weren't rare scandals. In 14th century France, an entire convent in Poitiers was investigated after rumours spread that multiple sisters were pregnant at the same time. Locals whispered that the convent was less a house of God and more a brothel. When inspectors arrived, They found newborns hidden in baskets, secret tunnels used by visiting men, and terrified young women trying to explain away their condition as divine punishment. The solutions? Brutal. Sometimes the women were expelled, shaved bald, and branded as whores. Other times, the convent simply buried the infants in unmarked graves within its own gardens, hoping no one would ever find out. Archaeological digs near old convent grounds have unearthed tiny skeletons, silent testimony to the lives erased before anyone dared to speak of them. In some cases, the fathers weren't strangers slipping in through the night, but priests themselves. In one scandal in Lübeck, Germany, the confessor of a convent was accused of fathering children with several of the sisters. When questioned, he claimed the women had tempted him, like Eves in a new Eden. The bishop transferred him quietly to another diocese. The nuns were locked in their cells for life. But not all stories ended in tragedy. A set of court records from Florence in the 15th century describe a nun who gave birth in the convent kitchen. Rather than hide it, she declared the child a miracle and tried to convince her sisters it was a new Christ child. For weeks, the convent was divided, some believing, others horrified. Eventually, authorities stepped in. The nun was executed for blasphemy. The baby was taken away, its fate unrecorded. And then there were the darker, quieter stories. Midwives summoned in secret, instructed never to speak of what they saw. Babies drowned in basins before their first cry. Other infants smuggled out to nearby villages and left on church steps. The convent walls were supposed to seal out temptation, but instead they sealed in scandal, forcing desperate women to make impossible choices. You can imagine the terror, a young nun realising she is pregnant, morning sickness she cannot explain, whispers among the sisters as her shape changes, the abbess staring at her with a mixture of fury and shame. She knows what's coming: punishment, disgrace, maybe even death. There's no joy of motherhood here, only fear and silence. These stories were so widespread that by the late Middle Ages, bishops had manuals with protocols on how to deal with pregnant nuns. Most suggested secrecy, quick punishment, and moving the women far from their communities. The goal was always the same: protect the reputation of the convent, no matter the human cost. The idea of pregnant nuns horrified medieval society because it exposed what everyone already suspected, that beneath the vows, beneath the locked gates, desire didn't disappear, it only grew stronger in isolation. And sometimes that desire left undeniable proof. By now you've seen the pattern: the glossy image of the medieval nunnery, quiet halls of prayer, pure virgins lost in devotion, was more propaganda than truth. The reality was darker, dirtier, and infinitely more human. These were places of power struggles, secret relationships, whispered scandals, and the kind of compromises that made survival possible in a brutal world. Behind the high stone walls, women wrestled with the same instincts and desires as anyone else: hunger, lust, loneliness, the craving for control over their own lives. Some nuns became scholars, preserving knowledge when the outside world burned. Others became healers, midwives, or mystics whose visions shook entire kingdoms. But many were simply trapped, sent there by families who wanted to avoid paying dowries, forced into vows they never chose, left to endure lives they didn't want. And when desperation boiled over, it wasn't just whispered prayers that filled the air. It was the sound of lovers sneaking through gates at night. It was the muffled cries of infants who weren't supposed to exist. It was the groan of punishment, doors locking on women condemned not for crimes, but for being too human in a place that demanded the impossible. The church tried to hide it all, to scrub out the stories, bury the bones, rewrite the records. But history leaks through the cracks. In court documents, in archaeological digs, in the rumours that clung to convents like mildew, we catch glimpses of the truth. Medieval nunneries were never as holy as the paintings suggest. They were messy, compromised, alive with all the things polite society pretended didn't exist. So next time you see a serene medieval painting of a nun gazing at the heavens, remember the hidden chapters. Remember the sisters who resisted, who loved in secret, who carried shame in their bellies or dug graves in the garden. Remember that purity was the ideal, but imperfection was the reality. That's the real story of the nunneries. Not piety untouched by the world, but humanity trapped inside walls that couldn't hold it.